Hello and welcome to today's episode of the On The Up podcast, brought to you from Moneypenny. I'm your host, Dan Marshall, and today I'm joined by Callum from JE Consulting to talk about how Gen Z is the future of your firm. So Callum, do you want to start off by just giving us a little intro to yourself and what you do at JE?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. So I'm Callum Macrae, Marketing Director at JE Consulting. So we're a marketing agency that work with a lot of professional firms, about 150 professional firms across the UK. We've been going for almost 30 years, and we essentially are a full service marketing agency, either plugging ourselves into existing resource that firms have in-house or acting as a fully outsourced marketing team. So yeah, we do a range of everything from website, social media, SEO, paid media, everything marketing we do in-house at JA.
Amazing. Sounds really broad. So it probably gives you lots of challenges and lots of different things to think about, but also lots of fun as well.
Yeah, I think no 2 days are the same. So my background before that was software side, working for Iris Software for nearly 15 years. And then I made the jump agency side. And I've always been fascinated with agency because that variety, no 2 days are the same. And I worked with a lot of agencies in my previous role. And just that, constant variety and understanding that you go on one call with a top 100 firm, then you might be on the phone to a healthcare provider, or just that mix is great, really. So yeah, loving it.
Excellent. How did you find that switch? I know sometimes some people in the marketing world are kind of love-hate agency relationships, aren't they?
Yeah, and I spoke to quite a few people about their experience who obviously I worked with at agencies during my time in my previous role, and they gave me some great advice that you're often probably perceived to be a swan, as they call it. So you're on the outside on every call looking very, smiley and everything's great, but under the water, your feet are paddling constantly. I think the pace was quite interesting in terms of I'm used to a very fast-paced environment, but I think agency, you have to be prepared to be quite knee-jerk and pivot quite quickly. But I love that, as I say, the variety has been quite great.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I suppose like you point before, you mentioned about how the types of clients you can be dealing with could be very different. They'll have very different budgets, very different ideas, different brand perceptions. There's a lot to get your head around sometimes.
Yeah, and I think it's the mix of clients, to your point, is that a lot of them, they don't know what they don't know. So it's up to us to advise and make suggestions and be the ideas factory almost. So we have to be quite creative in the ways that we do that because, to your point, Dan, a lot of them maybe don't have huge budgets. Some of them do, and that gives us a lot more creative freedom. But when they don't, we have to think on our feet and think, how can we be disruptive through organic channels, and how can we make a name for themselves in other ways? So yeah, it keeps us on our toes.
Nice. And one of the things that I guess as an agency you have to think about, but also everybody in marketing and in business more generally, which is what we're going to talk about today, is Gen Z, and that how kind of as time has moved on, Gen Z are fast becoming the most, I think there's some stats that say it's going to be one of the biggest kind of age groups of people entering or in the workplace already, and will be for some time. So there's potentially a lot of evolution that businesses, marketers, everybody else in a company, I suppose, as well, needs to do to appeal to Gen Z, both in a marketing sense, but also in an employment sense as well. So
yeah,
it's a big change.
A huge change. And I think it's this thing though, as if you look at millennials, that was a huge change. Like with every generation, there's going to come change. I think with Gen Z in particular, and to your point, I think it's nearly a third of Gen Z are expected to make up the workforce by the end of 2025, the end of this year. And it's really forcing businesses to think differently, because this is the generation that have grown up with everything digital being at their fingertips. iPads, everything is now freely available. Gone are the dial-up days, which is what I grew up with, where you had to use dial-up internet, wait for the internet to take 15 minutes to load up. Everything's so much more instant. And I think from a marketing perspective, that's where businesses are realizing that they really have to up their game now in order to catch the attention of Gen Z.
Absolutely. You just got me thinking back to the dial-up days where you couldn't use the phone and use the internet at the same time in the house. So if we were to think about Gen Z and define them, I think you touched on there, they're kind of digital native, I suppose, but a Gen Z person these days, how how old would they be at the moment? I guess that would be people from kind of 20-ish
Yeah, so they're
upwards.
born mid-90s, so I, missed the bracket, unfortunately. I'm sat here talking about Gen Z, and I'd love to say that I am one, but I'm not, just outside the bracket. So yeah, mid-90s to early noughties.
Yeah.
They've, as I said, grown up with digital technology at their fingertips, and everything's been so freely available. So their way of thinking is slightly different to millennials and slightly different then to boomers and every other generation. So of course there's going to be a different expectation.
Definitely. And I think in a marketing context as well, you think digital first, and you also maybe think as millennials we were social first, I suppose, or we became social first because we didn't have it when we were growing up, or when we were children, when we were teenagers, a lot of that came out. But I guess Gen Z have had that probably from the age of from birth, more or less, really. And I guess some of those platforms have been out, so
Yeah, from
very social
get-go.
first.
I think I remember finishing school and Facebook was kind of just coming in. Before that it was MySpace and
Yeah.
similar kind of platforms, but Facebook was really that big first one. Nowadays you've got so many different platforms that, to your point, are freely available to them at quite a young age. Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, all these other platforms that we just didn't have, but now this is right there at their fingertips.
It's just embedded into their culture, isn't it?
It is.
I guess that then presents a challenge for businesses, right? Because and a lot of the leadership in businesses will not have been used to that kind of stuff being at people's fingertips, so they have to think differently.
Yeah, I think if you think now of how a professional firm thinks, how they get their clients, and a lot of that still comes from referrals, and that's probably never going to change. And that's obviously still one of the main channels where professional firms do get their business. And I think anyone who's not getting a lot of their business from referrals should absolutely explore that, because that's a no-brainer, right? Word of mouth is still probably the most popular. But I think if we rewind 5 years ago, having a website was seen to be quite forward thinking, and the phrase digital shopfront was used quite often. And now I think if you've got a website, great, but that's 101 stuff now. And I think this is where I always say you've got your shop front in the form of the website, but social media is then in effect the shop floor. And this is, I think, is where firms really have to embrace social media and other platforms around them. If I quite often speak and meet with firms, and I'm quite surprised when they don't have a social media presence. And then equally, there's nothing worse if they do have a social media presence, but I always probably liken it to, you've got a shop window, but inside there's no clothes because you've not updated your social media content since 2020. That's neither nor use nor ornament.
Yeah.
So I think there is a huge shift for firms who have never really thought about this before. They've seen that they've got a website, and that to them is being really forward thinking. But now they are starting to wake up to the fact that Gen Z are going on social media to find out what firms are posting, both in terms of content, but then also culture. That's a massive thing now for Gen Z, particularly when it comes to talent. And we speak quite often now about this talent shortage that's been around for the last few years, if not longer, in the industry. And I agree that there is a talent shortage, but I also think there's a shortage of appeal. And I think what I mean by that is that firms themselves not appealing to this younger generation in the form of their digital marketing and how they're presenting themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point as well, because there's a kind of distinction of the journey of the website was kind of all you needed, to social is what you need, but it's still not acceptable. Maybe some people think it's acceptable, but it's still not the best thing to do to just have social. It's about what you're creating, what you're posting out there as well. And I imagine for certain professional services companies, particularly, I guess, on the bigger, more traditional sides, thinking, some law firms, accountants, it's a very kind of professional image, isn't it? And it's very sort of, I suppose, I would call it like brand heavy in a sense. And is that the content that a Gen Z person actually wants to engage with on social as well?
Well, I think it's that, within professional firms, they're quite often to be seen as quite traditional in how they present themselves. And I think this is where Gen Z are slightly forcing that change. You can still absolutely be a traditional firm, but again, how are you shouting about that through your marketing? So, we work with a lot of firms who would, potentially class themselves as traditional, but then how do you define core values and those kind of things that help you present yourselves as a traditional firm, but you're starting to talk about your culture, you're starting to talk about values, which again, that wasn't probably a conversation several years ago. And it is great now whenever we work with firms and we sit down and go through that process with them, because I've seen it done in probably the worst way where it can be done, which is I've seen people in firms where it's literally 3-4 people going in a room and deciding, here's our values, here's our vision, this is what we stand for. Whereas actually it's about getting the whole team involved. That's part of your DNA. And then pushing it out to market, Gen Z see that and they can also see through it.
Yeah.
I think that's the great thing about that demographic is they know what's real and what isn't. So I think it's got to be embedded within your culture, within your staff, that you're defining those values, that you're broadcasting them out. But I think to your point around the social media content, it has to be a mix. I think there's definitely still a place for the informative content. At the end of the day, these are solicitors, accountants. You've got that informative content, which is what people want to paint you as the thought leader, as the expert. But where's that personality, which is what people want now from social media? You know, LinkedIn is fast becoming the new Facebook, as they call it, because people are starting to give a sneak peek into their personal life, either on their personal LinkedIn, but also now more so on company LinkedIn pages, you know, trying to bring a bit more personality. And I think that's what Gen Z want. They want to see that culture. They want a sneak peek inside the firm. And that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges that firms have to overcome.
100%. I also think there's, I have this real thing with social generally where I kind of try and draw a distinction between like the company page and the personal page. And I think one of the things that Gen Z have probably grown up with a lot of as well is influencers.
Yeah.
And it's all very well posting out kind of, I think, like your kind of thought leadership or your informational content from the company page, but there's also that side of, you know, whether it's the managing partner of a firm or someone like senior in a professional service company, you kind of also need to have a personal social profile these days as well, and actively put content out for people to engage with too.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that there's got to be that two-pronged attack, really, where you've got the company page or you're posting on there, but equally, you know, your C-suite, your senior leadership team need to be actively doing that as well. And of course, there's going to be some who are more comfortable at doing that. You know, personally, for me, when I first started posting on LinkedIn a few years back and started pushing out my own content, yeah, of course, I found it cringe and you're a bit like, oh, not sure if I should be doing that. Yeah. But I think over time, you get into your stride and you ultimately have to feel comfortable with what you're posting. So I know there's lots of people that I'm connected to on LinkedIn within the space who are very open, you know, and share a lot of their personal life on LinkedIn. That's a personal choice. You don't have to do that. And I think we almost need to remove that that's the only way of doing things. You know, it just because a certain few might choose to do that, it's not the only way. You know, I, for example, post a lot of content on my LinkedIn about my 2 dogs, which drive me up the wall. But, you know, dogs do great for LinkedIn, right? Who doesn't love a dog? But it's giving people a sneak peek into your personal life. And I think that's what people want to see now. It's that age-old phrase, right? People buy from people. Relationships are so important. So starting to give people a sneak peek into your life, again, you can control how little or how much you do that. But I completely agree that, again, when Gen Z are looking up for either a firm to work with in terms of you know, for clients or for talent, they are looking at their social media and they're looking not only at the firm's page, but then going on to the profiles of senior leadership as well and seeing their content.
Yeah, I think people just make more informed decisions, like say whether it's buying something or whether it's an employment consideration of like who you're buying from or who you're working with, and you want to understand them before you make that commitment.
Yeah,
I guess,
of course.
as well. And it's because, like you say, people buy from people, but also people then work with people as well, at least for the moment anyway, without AI taking over. But, you know, for the most part, if you're getting an accountant on board or a lawyer on board, they're going to be your accountant and you're going to speak to them regularly. Same if you're going to work for them, you're going to see them every day. So it's important that people see some of that personal side, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And for me, I think there's nothing worse than whenever I go on somebody's LinkedIn profile and it says, Callum hasn't posted recently, because that immediately makes me switch off, and I want to engage with somebody, understand more about them. So as I said, I think just start posting, start giving people a bit of an insight. It could be content related to your firm, or sharing an asset that the firm has created but posting it through your own channel, and start to connect with like-minded people, with your peers, but then over time start to give people a bit of a sneak peek into your life. One of my, I think the most engaged post on my LinkedIn profile last year was about rosé wine. I would add that it was about marketing as well. It wasn't just about rosé wine, but it was the famous chicken wine, which the chicken rosé wine that went viral, and Waitrose did this really clever marketing where they actually changed the label of the wine and called it the chicken wine. And I just did this simple post, and it just went off, and before I knew it, I had the wine manufacturer commenting on my LinkedIn, got so many impressions just from that one simple thing that took me 2 minutes to probably think of. So I'm not saying post about rosé wine, but you get the point. It's just trying to give people a bit of a sneak peek into who you are, and you can still then point it back to your service, like I did with marketing, for example.
100%. And I think you kind of touched on how Jen said the digital first mentality as well, and how you've always done the same thing there, because you've found something that's trending, that's topical, and that's what you've rolled into your content, and you've made it relevant to marketing as well. So it's kind of taking moments from culture or real life, isn't it, and rolling that in. That's going to get you the engagement with these kind of people.
100%. The same way that you see on Instagram, on TikTok, where you have those trends. LinkedIn is, as I said before, I think there's this phrase that LinkedIn's becoming the new Facebook, it's becoming the new Instagram. And that's because people want the personal content. You can still link that to your service or your offering, but what people are wanting is to see that personal content. And I think that's where trends, there's been the recent one on LinkedIn of the AI action figures and things like that. That again is a very subtle way of just jumping on a trend, putting yourself out there and showing that you're engaging with it, because it starts to bring a bit more personality to your content.
100%. Yeah, I love that trend, and I jumped on that trend too. And I did a similar thing. I kind of mentioned in my post how I showed that to my 3-year-old, and I was like, "Who's this?" And he said it was his dad, and that was my post on LinkedIn. And again, it was like one of these better posts, because you connected your personal life to the trend. So.
Yeah, that's it. You could choose your accessories that you wanted, that matched to you, that give people a bit of a sneak peek, and you could just have fun with it. I think that's the thing, is that social media in itself is supposed to be fun. So of course there is a serious place for it as well. But again, a lot of the content that will drive engagement is that personal, fun content.
How have you found then, like, the conversations go with the clients of you guys when you're talking about these things? Are they generally receptive to doing stuff like that, or does it feel kind of alien to them and their backgrounds?
I think it's a bit of a mix. I think you've got some that are definitely more receptive than others. I think you've got some that are very much, this is the way that we've done things. If it's not broke, let's not try to fix it. But obviously it's our job to help advise the clients that we work with as to, here's how we would recommend doing things. And I always think it's nice to be pushed outside of your comfort zone now and again. So sometimes we have to do that. But as I say, some are a lot more receptive to it than others. But again, it's that thing of start small, scale, test it, see what happens. And it could be anything from, if your firm did a webinar, posting a clip of that webinar on social media, just things like that to start putting yourself out there. But yeah, some are definitely more receptive than others.
And I guess it's someone said to me the other day that the best way they found to sell to accountants, for example, is to tell them what other accountants are already doing that they're not doing, and then they'll go, "Oh, I want to do that." And I guess it's a bit of FOMO, isn't it?
It's a FOMO effect. Yeah.
And I imagine that's the same. Like, if you can find some examples of certain professional services companies that do it really well, and you can show that engagement, that's kind of giving people the impetus to do it themselves as well.
Yeah, I always think when it comes to a competition, it's healthy to pop your head over the fence to see what other firms are doing. And obviously the firms that we work with, we're doing that analysis anyway for firms. But we're trying to be that forward thinking arm to the business of here's what you should be doing from a marketing perspective. But it is healthy to look over the fence and see what the competition are doing, because it keeps you on your toes and it allows you to get in first sometimes and almost set the bar for others to follow. Or equally, you see an idea and it's like, oh, okay, that's quite good. Like, how could we spin that and do something that's relevant for said firm? So yeah, I think it is healthy and it is important for that. I think the way that we're seeing things move forward now, particularly with AI, as you mentioned, we're starting to probably see that tested a lot more in marketing. And I think we're going through this interesting shift, you know, with AI avatars and a lot of interesting content that could be done there. I think in the next 12 months, it'll be interesting to see how that breaks through, because I think it's at the top trying to bang on the door to get in. And there's some firms that are already starting to use it. And it's great content, you know, for people who aren't comfortable speaking on camera. And AI avatar is a great example of how you could create something that is you, or as close to you as you could get. You know, it takes your voice, it takes your video, your movement, but you're not doing the cringy 60-second recording to camera. It does it for you. So I think there's definitely going to be a place for that, and I'm quite excited to see how that maps out.
I think there's another interesting link back to Gen Z as well, isn't it? That they are, you know, a lot of these people are still on the younger side, and they're learning and developing in their careers, but also in their personal life, with AI being a key part of that now. Like, that's, you know, we spoke the other week about how Gen Z search, and we're speaking about social search, but also people will now use LLMs to search for things rather than going onto Google as well. So when these younger generations are embedding that in what they're doing, kind of means that in the future, when they become the leaders of these companies, they're going to be thinking like that anyway.
Yeah.
But leaders today need to also be embracing that as well.
Yeah, I think obviously the obvious one, ChatGPT, right? You think of how reliant, you know, I probably use it every day, and a lot of people have started to really lean on it, but it's fast becoming a search engine of its own, because people, you know, Gen Z or all generations are going on saying, you know, give me the top 10 accountants in Manchester, for example. And it's fast becoming a search engine as well as for its use as ChatGPT. So I do think that again is a shift for businesses, where they have to realize, okay, they're using these tools, how can we start to get ahead? But also then how these tools are used within the firm. You know, a lot of firms are starting to test and engage with AI tools, AI platforms. And that again now is for Gen Z who are looking for a career, that's becoming on the checklist of things that they want to do and explore. So I think that's again an opportunity for firms who do want to attract the Gen Z talent. You have to think about how you're leveraging AI. And if you're not, that demographic's the perfect demographic to help you start leveraging it. You might not know the answers, but this demographic could help test and find different ways of doing things, and that's a great thing.
Yeah, different perspectives, different ways of working, different ways of thinking. It's all going to be valuable to firms' growth, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's interesting as well, because I think another point to it is you need to be demonstrating that you're on the sort of cutting edge of technology and developments to appeal to people, both it could be in the recruitment sense, but it could also be in your product sense as well. As you know, as an accountant, are you saving your clients time or money by using AI to do the simple processes? Or
I think, you know, if you put yourself in the shoes of an accountant and you think of a potential client, if you were to turn around and say to a client, we're using Windows 98 and we're doing everything on paper based, the client would be walking out the door. So think of your staff in that situation. If you're still doing things that are very manual and you're not embracing this new technology, it's quite clear then that your staff are going to be walking out and going to your competitor down the road. So I think that's where firms need to start embracing. And again, it's not a case of doing everything. I think this is the thing of not to overwhelm yourself. Start to pick and choose the one or two easy things, and equally if you've got a younger demographic in the workforce, start to lean on them a lot more. I think within Gen Z in particular, there's this whole entrepreneur-intrapreneur debate. You know, they've got this entrepreneurial spirit. They might not want to go and set up their own business, but actually they are intrapreneurs in the sense of if you give them a project internally, they'll go away and do it. And that again is a gift in itself. You know, I've worked with a lot of Gen Z talent in my time, and I think where they've got that responsibility to go away and own a project and have oversight of that and responsibility, they will deliver. So lean into that entrepreneur aspect.
Yeah, I was going to say, as you were talking about that, like how does the business ensure that they lean into that to maximize, I guess, maximize your people, isn't it? But also to you're empowering them, you're making them feel valued as well, aren't you?
Yeah, I think it's the two words that you just said, Dan. It's leaning in, and I think that's what a lot of businesses need to do. And it also comes down to trust. You know, there's definitely this thing of you've still in some cases got people at the top who are just afraid of letting go. And I think that's where it doesn't have to be these huge projects. You could just oversee them with a certain project and let them run with it for a month and see what results come back. And you might find that you're surprised. And I think it's embracing that fail fast culture. That is very much now what Gen Z want. And I'm a huge fan of it. You know, I've worked with people in my time who've really encouraged this try and test culture, and if you fail, you're probably going to learn the most out of failure than you will out of success. So that's incredibly important, and I think having the environment where you've got the freedom to fail that's amazing for a potential employer to offer that, where they're encouraging the experiments and the tests, and it comes back to those marginal gains, right? A lot of 1% can add up and make a huge tangible impact. So absolutely empowering your staff and giving them the freedom to do that is only going to set you up for success, in my opinion.
And how do you think, I think the thing you mentioned, which is interesting there, is that, you know, people maybe struggle with letting go, or they're sort of scared of the risk of it. Like, how do you encourage people to do that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I've been a people manager in my time, and I've certainly kind of battled with that, because you often probably wrestle with it in your own head of, I'd just rather do it myself because I'll get it done that way. But I think the smart leaders and the smart businesses are the ones that hire the people that can do the stuff that you either can't do or you shouldn't be spending your time doing. And there's a whole field of experts out there that are way better at doing that. And I think it's those leaders who make that decision, and for themselves to empower themselves to do that. You know, if you're an accountancy firm or a legal firm, and you've got a certain function and you think, oh, well, I'll give it a go, I'll try doing this. You've got a whole field of people that you could probably choose that could do a way better job. So why not do that? I think always hire the best people for the role, and hire other people that are better at that role than you. You know, lean into it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thought throughout, I guess, like leadership discussions generally as well, like of how do you make yourself feel confident in letting go and relying on others to deliver things? Because I think you said at the beginning there, talking about this, that, you know, you've worked with a lot of Gen Zers who, when you've given them that freedom, have delivered.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do you encourage more people to do that, isn't it? And how do you maximize them?
And I think it does circle back to trust. You know, whenever I've given people that freedom and that responsibility, I know by doing that, it's making them more loyal to the business because we're giving them that freedom. So we're then going to increase the retention rate of those staff because they want to stick around, they want to learn. You're also giving the staff so much more exposure to learning. So if you're going to bring somebody in and say, this is your remit, this is what you're going to do, Gen Z are hopping jobs now more than any other generation. I think the average is that they're hopping jobs every 1.5 years, and then they're moving on to the next challenge. So if you're giving them that constant freedom, you're giving them almost, you know, extra opportunities to expand, to learn. They're going to be more sticky as an employee, and they're going to want to stay around and see what's the next project, what can I next sink my teeth into.
Yeah.
But I think, again, that for a leader or a business, it can be tricky. But you have to think, for all the effort that it takes to hire talent, do you want them to leave in 1.5 years? Or would you rather they stick around for a few years? So that's kind of where you've got to weigh up. And again, it could just be start small with a simple project, or it could be something that's been at the bottom of your to-do list for 6 months, and you keep thinking, oh, I'll get around to that. Maybe give a few of them projects to them and see what they come back with.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, because obviously, you know, everyone wants to retain their staff, especially if you're investing in training and developing people as well. But you got a question like why are people leaving, and
Yeah.
there's obviously all sorts of different motivations why people change jobs, but
I think on that point, I don't think salary is the only motivation now.
yeah,
And I think that's what's really interesting for Gen Z. Salary, obviously, we all come to work, we all want to get paid, we all have bills, mortgages, etc. to pay. But that is not the sole motivator for them. It's very much having that culture, that environment, the learning and training opportunities. Again, whenever I've worked and managed Gen Z in the past, they're eager to learn and they're hungry to learn. So giving them access to training courses that helps their growth. It helps you as an employer because you're giving them a whole new skill set that they didn't have before, which they can then apply to your business. They're then going to be more sticky to retain and stay around for a few years. So it's a win-win, but I think again, it's unlocking that mindset shift. But for Gen Z, if they're not getting that growth, they're not getting those opportunities, gone are the days of, right, I'm going to give you X, Y, Z on top of your daily routine. So basically your job's changing, and they're not afraid to question that now and say, okay, so my role's changing. Can I have the benefits that come with that role? Then they're not afraid to ask. And I think that's where they have, there's some interesting research out there from Grant Thornton from a few years ago about how Gen Z will work within the confines of their hours and not much over. And I think this comes back to this ongoing conversation with Gen Z about, and I often get asked this, do you think that they're entitled? And my response is no. I just don't think they want to make the same mistakes that the generations before them have made. If you think of how much, and I think Cypher HR did some really great research on this a few years ago, where they showed the amount of time that was spent as in unpaid overtime that we as employees all do every year. And the numbers are quite interesting. And Gen Z are looking at those numbers thinking, I'm not getting paid for that, so why would I put in that time? So they're not afraid to ask for the reward. As I said, salary is not the only motivator. I think what comes with that reward is the training opportunities, the chance to progress their career and get promoted quicker. If you think of boomers and the generations to follow, millennials, they'll stick around in a job and it's ingrained with you at a young age of, you get on that career ladder, you start from the bottom, you work your way up, you might stay at a company 10 years. I stayed at my last company 15 years. They're not afraid to hop around and get what they want and what they need. So I think if you don't lean in, you lose out.
Yeah, and I always think another factor with it as well, and I don't really have any data or research in mind to back this up, but I just felt this is a assumption I've built about Gen Z in a way, is that they also want to have an impact in what they're doing. Like, I think if you think like broader, it's probably the generation that are most kind of acutely aware of like environmental impacts and things like that generally. But also in their working lives, they wanna make a difference, and sometimes that, or a lot of the time, I think that comes from empowerment in the workplace, doesn't it? Because you might not, as a marketer, you're probably not going to change lives, right? Unless you suddenly the next Apple or something, I don't know. But like, if your empowerment can be to make a difference to the business, or like could be like a growth metric or something like that. So, I think that's a key thing as well. Like how it comes back to trust. I think, like you said, hiring the right people for the jobs and letting them do them as well. So,
and I think they're not afraid to question how businesses can do things differently. You think of things like ESG and the environment. Again, rewind 5 years, it might have been, in the conversation slightly, but now it's at the forefront and businesses are making a conscious effort in terms of what they're doing for ESG, environment, etc. I think that's, again, quite an important factor for Gen Z. You look at what's going on in the world with the climate and everything, they're very switched on and much more tuned in. And going back to the previous point, they've seen generations before them mess up the planet in that sense. So they're now trying to fix it and pick that up. And I think that's where they're trying to lead with purpose, to your point. They want to have that impact. So I think businesses that are more tuned into that and showing that they're making a conscious effort in terms of ESG, the environment, again, those are going to be attractors, definitely.
Yeah, and I think it's the point. So when people ask that question about whether they're Gen Z entitled as well. Just as we've been talking there, I kind of feel like it's maybe, and this might be doing a disservice to other generations, but maybe they just have more values and more belief and like and hold more importance to those values than you're thinking of like we're like the kind of millennial generation, and we've kind of got that view of like, well, you want to get on at work, you've got to work hard, you sort of almost got to do the job that you want to do before you get the job of it. Whereas Gen Z are maybe a bit stronger in the belief of like, well, if you want me to do that job,
Yeah.
I'll do it, but you've got to give me that. You've got
Yeah.
to give me that responsibility. So
Yeah, I recently recruited for a role, and one of the first questions, in fact, the first question that they asked me when we sat down was, "What are your values at JE Consulting?" And I was like, "Wow, okay, like we're actually there now. Like this is starting to be at the forefront of the conversation." And I have a great example of one of my relatives who qualified as an accountant a few years ago, just after COVID. And she applied for grad schemes at 3 top firms near where she was based. And she ended up going to work for none of them and chose to go to work for a firm that was 45 minutes further commute, because it gave her more flexibility, but also because she aligned more with their values. And that, again, is, I think, going back to one of the earlier points of how you go about that process, is the team need to be involved in what your values are, what you stand for. And it's definitely becoming much more of the selection process. So when Gen Z are looking not even just to work for, but to work with, so clients now as well are starting to look at firms of accountants, firms of solicitors. What are your values? Does that align with my business and where I want to be? So it's definitely now at the forefront of the conversation. And again, 5 years ago, it'd be like, oh yeah, values, like let's do it because we need to. Now it's you have to.
and they'd be very generic values a lot of the time, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a good example as well of how I think Gen Z kind of represents a bit of a leveler and an opportunity where, like you say, someone, you know, coming out of university or whatever, or apprenticeships more so as well these days, in accountancy would have often looked to those big firms as being like the gold standard of like where you want to be and where you want to start your career out. But actually, like in that example you've mentioned there, she's chosen a different path because the company represents the values to her. And, you know, I don't think a millennial would have been making those decisions like 10, 20 years ago, would they? They'd have been going, I want to be in the big four.
Yeah, I
because
want to
it's
go for the big four.
sort
I
of
want to
thing.
start at the bottom. I want to work my way up. And now it's, well, if I can get more flexibility, I align with their values, I've got more training opportunities. Again, it's the checklist. And I think it's not just about salary, you know, and it's not just about your reputation maybe as a top 4 or top 20 firm. It's thinking about what else are you giving that that potential person. And it just goes back to the retention point, you know, how can you keep them around?
The flexibility point's an interesting one to see what you think about that as well, because I always think there's a bit of a contradiction for me where we all want to work flexibly, and I like working hybrid. I like that I can work from home, but I have an office as well. But then I also sometimes think that, you know, starting out a career in marketing, I was in an office 5 days a week around people that I learned a lot from. So I think that's quite it's an interesting one. I can imagine that maybe being a bigger thought process for the lawyer, the accountant that was running their own firm, of like, I want the people around because I want them to learn from us and our way of doing things, but the people want the flexibility.
Yeah, and I think flexibility means different things to different people. So obviously there's a lot in the press now about certain firms bringing people in 5 days a week, and I don't think that is the right way to do it. I think there's obviously, you know, bigger decisions at play that, of course, if you have an office space, there's bills and stuff that have to be paid. So you're basically paying for an empty office. I understand that. I think it means different things to different people. You know, from me personally, echoing what you said, Dan, I started my career and it was 5 days in an office, and that was all I ever knew. And I actually remember once asking my boss at the time, having to work from home for a day because I was getting furniture delivered. And that in itself felt really odd.
You
I
used
was
to
like,
feel
oh, I
bad
feel
about it, didn't you?
working from home, like this is really strange. And then we had COVID, and then all of a sudden that changed the game. I think for me, it's balance. And, you know, as I say, for everyone, it's different. I've gone from software side to agency. So for me, being in the office, being around people in that collaborative environment where I can go and have that 2-minute conversation rather than avoiding 3 emails and a 30-minute Teams call or whatever, I can just nip over and have that conversation. But equally, the days where I am at home and I can just get stuff done without distractions and try to plow through stuff, I think it is that balance. And I think with Gen Z, again, you have to remember that this is the demographic that were at university and COVID hit and they had to leave the university campus, come home to their parents and kind of do their studying from there. So they've, in some cases, they've missed out on their university life and that kind of experience, if you like, that comes with it of being independent to a degree as well, and that whole university experience. I think I've seen it in my time where the pendulum can swing both ways. I've had Gen Z staff who really want to work remotely and that suits them. They are happy to come into the office every so often. The majority of them, from my own experience, do want to be in an office environment more often than not, but have that flexibility to work from home. And I think it just comes down to employers treating adults like adults, to be honest. I think, as I say, gone are the days where you're in 5 days a week, but I also think gone are the days where you're remote 5 days a week. I think there has to be this middle ground, but I don't think it's formulaic. I think it's what works for your business.
I think ultimately there's a lot, isn't there, for businesses to think about with the rise of Gen Zers, really, like whether it's your marketing, whether it's your retention, and then it's what you do day to day in your business. There's a lot of challenges, and also equally, like, there's not one answer for Gen Z as a whole, is there? It's like different people want different things. It's not, as much as it is about the generation of people, it's also about the individual as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's really hard and can be quite overwhelming if you try to do everything at once. So I think, from a marketing perspective, have you got a website? Great. Has it got a Comic Sans font on it? It's maybe time for an update. From a social media perspective, I think that's where, as I said before, about having that shop window, and quite often if I'm speaking, I'm like, put your hands up if you've got social media, and the majority of the room will put their hand up, and then it's like, keep your hand up if you've posted in the last week, and the hands all go down. So it's just starting to post a lot more and be consistent with that. I think that's probably the advice that I'd give. And then from a talent perspective, I think equally, now Gen Z are turning to your website, your social media channels. TikTok's now becoming a search engine instead of Google. I think 40% of Gen Z are now turning to TikTok instead of Google. So I've certainly seen a shift where professional firms are on TikTok. Which is again, it's great because that's a culture platform. It serves its purpose where, again, I think one of the most searched terms within the accountancy field is how much does an accountant earn? And you'll see like a lot of those videos on TikTok. But even if it's, top tax tips for this year, that kind of content can do really well. So I think, again, it's firms shifting that mindset of there's probably 30, 60-second content that they could be using for tools like TikTok. But again, if you're that partner in a firm who's maybe a boomer or of the older generation, you're thinking, I'm never going to do that. There's maybe younger staff in your workforce who could do that for you. So again, pick the people that's best to do that and lean into it and start to build your presence on platforms like TikTok. There's no harm in doing it. There's nothing lost and everything to gain. So there's some really great examples where some younger people in the accountancy world are doing that kind of explainer content on there, and I think come back to people buy from people. If you're a younger business owner that's looking for an accountant, you're probably looking for an accountant who's like you as well. So surfacing those people can be a kind of quite a good selling point, I suppose, for those bigger professional services firms as well. And I think it's seeing that person again and going back to that human relationship, but also just as how people, our kind of the way that we do things is changing. TikTok, great example. I used to have like books of recipes or whatever. I used to love a cookbook. Now 30-second TikTok video, love it. Like, get what I need from it and off I go. I think that's, again, the shift in behavior as that mindset. So again, firms and businesses need to wake up that this is a shift. It's only going to increase. That 40% is definitely going to increase to a much bigger statistic. So
no, like I say, there's a lot of different things to think about there. So I think you've covered off lots of interesting points that should get people thinking and starting to consider how they approach these things, and hopefully get more companies coming to your agency and more of your clients asking you about how do we do a TikTok feed? What should we be putting on there? So lots of great stuff there. The final thing we wanted to kind of cover off today is, we run the On the Up book club as well. So we asked you to recommend a book for our guests. So love to hear what book you'd like to recommend.
Yes, I have it here with me. So I Love Anything by Dan Sullivan. And I got gifted this book actually after one of my speaking gigs. So it's 10 times is easier than 2 times. And it's a great book because, again, for me, it completely shifted my mindset of things, again, that you think are unattainable or not achievable. It's more psychological and changes your ways of thinking of how to do things. He's got some great books out there. I think the other one is Who Not How or How Not Who. Yeah, I love books like this because I think I'm a huge fan of every day you can learn something different. And if I can, going back to the marginal gains, if I can start to have a lot of those 1% that make a huge tangible impact, I definitely recommend this book for that reason.
A great read. Wow, amazing. Well, I'd just like to finish off then by saying thank you for your time, Callum. It's been really interesting to talk to you today. And like I say, I think there's lots of different things for people to think about. Maybe not necessarily easy answers to a lot of these things that people need to think about, but I think that it's pushing people in the right direction, challenging the sort of status quo of professional services firms. So hopefully a lot to be gained for people there. But thank you so much for coming in and joining us today. It's been great to speak.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the On the Up podcast, brought to you from Moneypenny. Stay tuned for our next episode coming soon.